Oh, we still have it open. Welcome to another edition of Profiles. I'm your host, Ed Hyland. And in this session, we'll get into the science of politics. Joining us is Dr. Robert Bledsoe, Professor Emeritus at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Bledsoe's research interests include international and space law, the military budget process, U.S. defense policy, and Vietnam. His publications include a dictionary of international law. Welcome, Bob. Appreciate you coming by and joining us today.
Thank you, Ed. My pleasure.
Let us start just a little bit talking about the military budget process, which pretty much in my mind dovetails in with U.S. foreign policy. We have many actions going on right now. At the same time, we're struggling to get our budget act together. And the military is in fact saying we will need continued support, more dollars, to do what we do just on the police action side in Afghanistan and Iraq. How does all this jive, if you will? I mean, it seems like it's difficult to separate one from the other.
Well, you have the military, of course, is simply an instrument of foreign policy. So its existence and the way that it's structured, its missions, they all revolve around what the government perceives to be its role, its national interest. And once that's defined, then they structure their force levels and their types of equipment and what have you around what it is we want to accomplish or maintain or protect in our operation in the international system. What the military does then is they have sort of like in business, you've got long-term plans you develop, and so the military has 5-year plans for development to project out what they're going to need to have over the next 5 years. And the budget then is built upon those projected needs and what they define the different elements of their force structure to be to meet those needs, whether it's strategic, land, naval, air, what have you. This then goes through the congressional mill. And Congress, of course, in many instances has its own vision of what the U.S. foreign policy should be. It's not solely the domain of the executive branch. And so the military actually plays to more than one master, and the masters aren't always marching to the same drummer. So it's a bit of a challenge for the military to try to design their budget and determine what their needs are when they have multiple clients that they have to deal with. The additional problem for them is while they they have to design force structures to project on into the future a certain number of years. In international politics, you can wake up the next morning and there are all kinds of surprises. And so when the United States decides to respond to a particular problem or a particular opportunity, if it's going to involve the military, then the military's got to be ready to respond in whatever fashion the president and the rest of the foreign policy establishment want it to. It may or may not have structured itself to be able to optimally deal with what it is the president and the rest of the foreign policy community decide to do, what moves they're going to make, and it may or may not have anticipated budgetary needs to respond to that. As a consequence, for immediate short-term problems, it has sort of petty cash slush funds, if you will, that it can dip into, but for longer-term major problems, like, for example, our presence in Iraq now, which is not something the military would have envisioned a number of years ago, having the bulk of its structure be dedicated to, you have to go in and get special funding and supplemental fundings from Congress. Otherwise, you're going to be eviscerating your other missions and your other pools in the budget to try to deal with this. So there's the standard budget for the military, and then there are supplemental budgets, and then emergency budgets, and then special ones like you have with Iraq right now.
Two things came to mind. One was the word flexibility, and maybe I'll jump into that in a couple of moments. But when you raise the subject of budgets and some of the things that we're involved in currently, especially in Iraq, it almost seems like the budget doesn't count because they have a budget and they have a plan, but then the supplemental budget comes in. And it's like, well, we have this budget and we have this plan, but gee, this happened. So we need $80 billion to do this, or we need $2 billion to do that. Does it kind of just thwart the whole idea of making a budget?
There's always been a budgetary dance that the military and Congress play with one another. I mean, this is nothing new. Congress wants to try to exhibit the notion of fiscal responsibility, as well as try increasingly, particularly since the Vietnam era, to get involved in the military process in terms of determining what are the appropriate weapon systems to have, what kinds of directions the military should go in, what its structure should look like. So there's always been this dance that the two play with one another, and one House of Congress will cut a certain program, another of the chambers of Congress will restore that money and cut a different program. They'll compromise in the middle. The budget comes out. It's not what the military wanted, so before the next budgetary cycle is over, usually they'll come back and they'll say, look, I just can't perform the mission. You haven't given me enough money. I need a supplemental. And Congress provides a supplemental because no person in Congress wants to be weak on defense. And so this is kind of a stylized, almost opera that plays out. But sometimes you get in then to really serious problems like we have now with Iraq and financially. And that's a totally different ballgame then. And so this entire budget that we're looking at with Iraq is sort of an offline budget. It's a whole different category now from the standard military process.
It seems, at least in my mind, that I've seen it with Republican and Democratic administrations, that there is a lack of flexibility. And what I mean by that is going into the first Gulf War, for example, in the early 90s. They were using up stuff left over from the Vietnam War because we hadn't prepared. We hadn't been flexible enough to have a ready force and a ready supply of munitions for that particular engagement. Are you seeing any changes, realizing that politics plays such a huge role in this, but are you seeing changes that would perhaps give us a military force that is flexible, a core force that could respond on a shorter notice basis and still be prepared with the most up-to-date equipment?
Well, that's a very interesting question. As long as we were in the Cold War era, where there were minor blips that came along from time to time that we or the Soviets or both had to deal with, by and large, the international system was pretty well defined. And as a consequence, you were able to design military doctrine and military equipment to reflect that doctrine that had a fair amount of staying power to it, because the system didn't change in 6 months. It didn't change in a year. Matter of fact, it really didn't change for several decades. And so that was a very comfortable environment, not just for planners, but certainly for the military, because the military, failure is not a good word in the military. So military planners, officers, they don't like to be surprised. And as a consequence of that, what has worked in the past, what's predictable, what seems to be effective, that's what clearly they're very, very comfortable with. I mean, they're staking their careers on this.
The rules have changed.
The rules have changed now with since the 1989-1990 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the implosion of the Soviet Union. I mean, this is a whole new world now. And flexibility, I mean, this is really what it's all about today. And this isn't the most comfortable environment then to operate in, because you have to design a mix of forces that can meet a variety of situations. Small, low-intensity operations, put out brush fires in Southeast Asia, but then you still have major problems with major competitors that require a large conventional military force, heavy armaments, these kinds of things. So you need a combination of forces that can be airlifted in on unimproved airstrips, and also then the typical kinds of tanks and howitzers and everything else that we have. It's extremely expensive to do that, number one. And so what you try to do then is to design equipment that can have multi-purposes to it, that gives you some of that flexibility. We're seeing part of the challenge to that, I think, today when you're looking at the military Humvees that are in Iraq, where we have these publicized stories where they're trying to go into dumps and arm them, get a little more armament on them, that kind of thing. They were light, to be flexible, to go into instantaneously into situations on very, very short order, be airlifted in on unimproved strips, this kind of thing.
They're
But
not
then
tanks.
they're not tanks, absolutely. Now you're having to try to make them a little more like a tank because of the threat that you have from bombs and landmines and this kind of thing that are activated by the dissidents. It's a real challenge in this kind of flexible environment. And you will always have those elements in the military who are very willing to try to innovate and respond to these new kinds of needs. But you'll also have the element in the military that wants to stick with what was tried and what was true. And there will oftentimes then be ways of doing things or hardware out there that you can try to respond to things with that aren't going to get a very positive reception as you move up the military hierarchy, because it is different and it's not as tried, and therefore it's more risky. And so that in a very flexible environment is quite challenging for the military. We have had our successes with it. For example, in the 50s, our first experiment with helicopters after World War II was in the Korean War, and they were primarily used for medical evacuation, for medevac, this kind of thing, and for observation. In the 50s, we began to experiment with using them in an air mobile capacity, using them as offensive weapons as well as troop carriers. And eventually this was well received by the military, and this became then standard doctrine in Vietnam. Fortunately, if we had to ad-lib our way through that one for that period of time, it would have been a little more difficult for us. But there have been other equipment that is interesting to use that the military has been much more reluctant to try to adopt, and so it takes time. It takes a great deal of time. And in this kind of environment where, you're right, flexibility, this is a very challenging world for the military to operate in, and it doesn't make for cheaper budgets. That's part of the problem. Everybody thought that there'd be a peace dividend now that the Soviet Union is gone. In point of fact, you've seen the military budget increase, and it's even increased in terms of constant dollars. And part of that is because we now have additional requirements on our military. Well, for example, we now are much more heavily into what we call the humanitarian side of what the military does. Now we're into democracy building and this sort of thing in countries, and that requires a whole different set of military demands, financial demands on the
building
military.
Schools is just as expensive as building bombs.
Absolutely. We used to always encourage the militaries of other countries to develop civic action programs because they were the most organized bureaucratic structure in third world countries that could respond to these challenges, building roads, electrification systems, sewage systems, these kinds of things. It was also a way to keep them from puttering around and overthrowing their governments, I guess. But our military, that wasn't something they loved to do. I mean, they were designed to go out and meet the Soviet Union on the plains of Europe and destroy their armored divisions and this kind of thing. We're now very much into the civil construction, the civic education, the community building side of things on a level in Iraq that we haven't been in since World War II, basically, with the Marshall Plan, with Germany, with Japan. And this can certainly escalate a budget as well.
You mentioned a moment ago Vietnam, and several people that I've heard anyway have compared the situation in Iraq to a type of Vietnam, at least in the sense that the insurgents are fighting a guerrilla war, and they've had some success. For the most part, the military has been able to crush the pockets as they appear, but that's a lot of what we thought we were seeing in Vietnam, and eventually that the tables turned there. Did we learn anything from Vietnam? Are we able to take any of that? Is there a parallel between Vietnam and what seems to be going on in Iraq now, and some other countries fighting a non-traditional type of war?
Well, there are some similarities. There are some major differences. The similarities would be, number one, there are internal dissidents in Iraq like there were in Vietnam. There are third countries that are supplying funding and personnel and equipment to what's going on in Iraq, just like there was in Vietnam. There is one fundamental difference that made Vietnam a much bigger challenge for us than Iraq is in one sense, and that is there was also another country that was sending in its military forces to counter another country, us, sending in their military forces. So it wasn't just placating domestic unrest in South Vietnam. You were fighting a war against a very well-trained military coming out of North Vietnam. In Iraq, the major difference is, in part you can contain it a little bit because the external players are primarily marginal players. North Vietnam was the major player in looking at what went on in Vietnam. They determined the intensity of the conflict and the direction of the conflict that was going to occur. In Iraq, it's largely internal. And so it's the dissidents themselves that determine the tempo, determine the targets, and I think this gives a little more of an opportunity to try to develop the domestic political structure that then itself can respond to the challenges to its regime on the part of dissident members within Iraq. It was difficult to do that in Vietnam because primarily the war was conducted by foreigners from the South Vietnamese perspective. It was conducted by Americans. It was conducted by North Vietnamese, who had never really gotten along too well with the Southern Vietnamese anyway, in their eyes. So the South Vietnamese were pawns in that war. In this one, the emphasis of the administration, rightly so, has been that this is Iraq that will respond to these challenges, and it will rebuild its country, and it will define its governing process and what the political coalitions are going to look like. So that what's going on in Iraq, although to many Iraqis and many viewers outside Iraq, it looks like it's an American operation. In point of fact, there is much more of an opportunity here than there was in Vietnam for this responsibility to be shifted to the domestic forces themselves, and probably have a greater chance of success than you had in Vietnam, where the regime in Vietnam stayed only because we supported them, and they were viewed as an alien regime by the South Vietnamese people themselves. Here you have an opportunity for people to identify and link with their government through parties and factions that they've helped support and select and put in, rather than it being a fait accompli by some external influence. So I think there are some similarities, but there are some differences. And
I guess I was thinking in terms of, foreign fighters have been known to come from various bordering countries into Iraq. And I suppose you could also argue that even though they may come from different countries, they have a similar cause, a similar government or leader, in the sense that it is a religious war for them. So that is an enemy, whereas in Vietnam it was China, for example, sending down these troops. Perhaps you could say there's a certain religious leader and forcing some of the action and some of the direction of the insurgents. Maybe far afield, but
yeah, that's a good point. There are the two kinds of wars that are the most challenging for you to try to diffuse are the ones where those that their spirit is imbued to fight by either religion or by nationalism. In the case of Vietnam, it was nationalism. And the Vietnamese that went south under the orders of Ho Chi Minh, they did so to free their brethren and to reunify the country. So this was very much a nationalist war. In Iraq, it's more complex here. You not only have a number of people who are motivated by their desire to successfully build in Iraq in an image other than that was built by Saddam Hussein, but there's also a heavy religious component in this one, and religious fervor can motivate people just as much, if sometimes not more so, than nationalism can, because we've seen historically some of the bloodiest wars in history have been in the name of God or Allah or whatever religion you happen to be motivated by. So that's an excellent point, Ed. Yeah, the religious element in this one makes it much more complex. The upside is the number of foreign individuals that are coming into Iraq to get involved in the insurgency is still considered to be relatively small. It's nothing like the infiltration of North Vietnamese into South Vietnam during that war on a monthly basis. The total number that they think is in Iraq is probably not even equivalent to what 1 month's infiltration was of the North Vietnamese army into South Vietnam. But there is the domestic religious element that plays very heavily in this. When you have as divided a country as Iraq is historically, even, it's not just with Saddam Hussein, but when you have Shiites and Sunnis, and it can be very, very challenging.
Throw the Kurds into the mix, and
throw the Kurds into the mix, and you really have an interesting arrangement.
Let's, in the few moments we've got left, if I could switch to kind of a domestic side of it. There's been considerable talk about the military and the base closings, and they're getting ready to go through some more of that. We have seen that firsthand, what can happen. And frankly, Central Florida, it would appear, came out very well. We have Baldwin Park, where there used to be a military base. Other communities, though, as we did initially, are fighting any closing or shutting down of military facilities. Are we cutting back domestically so much to feed the beast? There are so many things going on, and dollars are so precious now. It would seem that we're giving up things that some might say we might need in the future because they have a certain value, and they can convert those into dollars that we need immediately.
Yeah, for example, it looks like the Mayport Naval Air Station, that apparently is one that is in some trouble right now. The bottom line is that we built our basing structure to fight the Cold War, to fight communism, and as well as, and I don't try to say this in a partisan way, because Democrats were as bad as Republicans at this, in some respects even better at it than Republicans. A lot of bases are built solely because they're in a person's district who wanted to bring money into that district, who happened to be on the Armed Services Committee or a budget committee, something like that.
You got to save the bacon, sure.
Absolutely. So some of the base structuring that we have makes a lot of sense. It was designed by the military to meet specific kinds of needs to provide the support for the military structure. Others are there to placate votes in Congress to get your budgets passed that you needed from the Pentagon's point of view. So some of the restructuring, it reflects redesigning missions in a post-Cold War world. Other parts of the base restructuring and closing is simply an acknowledgement of, well, we really don't need this one. It really didn't have to be there at any point in time. But it made sure that that we had a yes vote for our budgets, and so we'll put it in there. But now, when the budget increasingly is under pressure with these additional needs that the military has, for example, we have a drug interdiction mission now for the military. In the Cold War, we never worried about drugs. Drugs is a big deal now. Well, that costs a lot of money and a different kind of equipment that we need to do that with. So while the budgets are going up, the available money that can be used out of this total pie the federal government has to devote to the military is actually shrinking, so that the military more and more has to have a really solid defensible rationale for why it makes the different budget requests. And so some of these base closings, well, it's just simply, that's the real world today. We have more limited resources, and we have to devote them where they're really needed.
Do you think some of what we've been talking about over the last few minutes combined will have an effect on the future of the military? And I guess I'm thinking National Guard along the way here, the volunteer army, as it has been called. Do you think we're going to see a greater emphasis on professional soldiers, or do you think that they will continue to, the military that is, continue to rely more on generating the National Guard type folks in the service, the folks who can be there when needed, but also when the action is over, then they can go back home?
That's an interesting question, because one thing that the military has not to this day been able to successfully resolve is its move from a draft to an all-volunteer military. The transition from that, from the time of the 70s onward, has not been an easy one, and the transition is far from over yet. The notion was to have a professional military, and to do that you were going to have to pay that professional military. In point of fact, we've never been able to maintain our pay levels in the military to be the equivalent of what their civilian counterparts would be. It's horrendously costly, and so they've been trying to, they've really, rather than meeting it head on, they keep playing around the edges with this. And then with your National Guard and your Reserve, these were never meant to do the sort of thing that they've ended up doing. And so it's costing a horrendous amount of money to do that, plus you're disrupting the lives of many, many thousands of American men and women. And that is another stopgap measure. Now, the military keeps saying we're never going to have to go back to a draft, we'll be able to deal with this problem. But in point of fact, many analysts would say what they've done over the last 25 years or so is they've band-aided the whole process. And I think that Iraq, whatever else it does or doesn't do when everything is done, will point out that the military needs to finally come to some successful resolution of the decision to make it a non-draft professional military and resolve that problem once and for all.
And kind of sounds like dollars will be involved.
Absolutely,
to do that.
Absolutely.
Well, Robert Bledsoe, thank you so much for coming by, talking to us today about all the different things that are going on and sharing your insights in the political science world.
My pleasure, Ed.
Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it very much.
And so ends another Profiles. Wanted to thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back. Take care.